Hello everyone, it's CRT Spotlight video time once again, and today I think it's finally time we cover one of my more requested televisions from the collection. This here is my Panasonic Tau model CT-20SL14J from June of 2004. So, much like JVC's iArt and Toshiba's AF series of picture tubes, the Tau line was Panasonic's direct competitor to Sony's successful line of WEGA Trinitron flat-face CRTs that began proliferating the market in the early 2000s. And despite the use of a shadow mask for phosphor color separation, compared to Sony's continued use of their aperture grill technology, these Panasonic tubes are still quite commendable when pitted up against their main rival. So let's begin with a rundown of what we can expect to find on this particular Tau. Along the front panel is, of course, where we have all of our physical controls for operating the TV, along with a front stereo composite input and a headphone jack hidden behind a fold-down door. I greatly appreciate how one of these buttons is dedicated to cycling between the television inputs. It's always frustrating when a manufacturer excludes this specific control from their television and requires you to have a matching remote to access these inputs. And then, taking a look at the back, we find pretty much the entire gamut of available video inputs, with coaxial RF, component, S-video, and a second composite video port. For you folks in NTSC land like me who really don't have a need for a SCART input on their CRTs, this thing pretty much has you covered in every other department. And since we're along the back, we might as well see what we are dealing with on the inside. And upon removal of the cover, we find more or less all that you might expect on a mid-2000s set like this. Now, certain models that came about later in the Tau line have been known to have Orion source tubes within them, which I know that for some reason is a massive deal breaker to certain individuals, but I can report that this television does in fact have a genuine Panasonic-made tube housed within it, so fear not, my fellow enthusiasts. However, keen-eyed viewers might be able to notice a certain detail that hints at the life that this particular CRT had before it wound up in my possession. Yes, unfortunately, this television did come from a smoker's home. When you mess around with used electronics enough, you absolutely will become familiar with these signs. The telltale brown tar-like residue that collects itself on all of the wires and PCBs is certainly the result of exposure to all that airborne nicotine smoke. Thankfully, though, this Tau wasn't saturated to the point where I needed to air it out and stuff it with some dryer sheets to eliminate the smell, but the shell itself still needed a pretty thorough scrubbing to restore it to its original gray color. However, I will use this discussion of smoke to attempt what will probably be the strangest segue I'll ever feature in any of my videos by saying, let's now hook up my fantastic Smoke Edition N64 and see how that video quality looks. Assuming that the majority of those using a late model CRT like this in the modern era would be using composite video and up, we'll start there. The composite image on this Tau is overall very respectable compared to some of its contemporaries. Color and sharpness are quite good, although initially when I first brought this set home, I had to do some tweaking of the settings to compensate for a rather dark image overall. You might still be able to see remnants of this flaw here, but occasionally this tube will suffer from issues with black crush, where particularly dark portions of the screen will be considerably darker than what they should be. Here in Rogue Squadron, it's most notable in areas of the terrain that are in the shadows. Before I compensated for this issue in the service menu, the problem was much more pronounced, and certain games were almost unplayable unless you were viewing the screen in a completely pitch-black room. Since adjusting my Tau, though, I've pretty much eliminated all of the black crush issue, save for a few of the most egregious situations, such as in this game here. Of course, I'm also recording this footage under bright natural lighting, with my camera's exposure setting adjusted accordingly, so this quirk will be much more visible in my footage here that you are currently viewing, versus how my eyes see this set in person. I can assure you that it is much less of an issue in real life. However, since we are currently on the subject, I do also want to bring up one other issue that this particular model Tau has regarding composite video. So, the video decoder in this television uses a one-chip design, where both the comb filter and jungle chip are contained within the same IC, which in this case is a Panasonic MN101E11GTD1. Many CRT televisions will have each of these components as individual chips on the board, with the comb filter tasked with dividing the luma and chroma portions of the composite video into their individual signals, and the jungle chip being responsible for separating the red, green, and blue outputs for driving the CRT's electron guns. Sometimes, though, both of these components will be combined into a single chip as a cost-saving measure. In the case for this unified chip inside of this 20SL14J, though, the composite video decoding is somewhat flawed, where depending on the video source, there can be noticeable dot crawl and blending artifacts visible on the screen. For instance, take a look at the bricks that are part of the background of this shot of Streets of Rage 2. You might be able to make out these little flashing specks of light in the blue highlights. These little blinking dots are not part of the game at all, and are in fact an impurity that is caused by this flaw in the one chip's design. Rainbow banding patterns can also plague the composite video on these televisions as well. Here is a still image of the waterfalls in Sonic the Hedgehog, which are notorious for these flaws. Switching over to the same screen over component video really amplifies how bad this problem is on this particular television. However, I feel that I'm being far too harsh on this Tau here regarding these issues. The Sega Genesis is quite notorious for having an absolutely abysmal composite video output to begin with, and these same image artifacts can often show up on many other televisions to varying degrees. And of course, this scrutiny I'm doing is taking place when depicting perfectly still images. Once you get motion involved, the blending of the phosphors on the screen, updating with each frame, does a pretty good job at masking these flaws. And it seems like these issues really do depend on the specific device outputting the video and just how pure of a composite signal is being fed to the television. Compare these results from the Genesis to what I'm able to get out of my Xbox 360 over composite. This looks way better, almost shockingly crisp. I certainly can't find anything to complain about here. And then things get even better when you make the switch over to component video on this tube. This is when the quality of the Tau really does begin to shine. Of course, I do apologize about any image loss you might be seeing, considering that this is a recording of a screen on your screen, and the particular shadow mask within this tube really doesn't play nice with any camera's image sensor. In person, this screen looks just fantastic. Of course, being that the Tau was Panasonic's premier line of televisions during the time period which this certain CRT was for sale, I think it'll also be very appropriate for this video if we also include some gameplay from Panasonic's premier video game and multimedia console on this tube as well. Now, I've sung a lot of praises for this company's products in some of my past videos, but I really want to take this moment to comment on how much I really love the assortment of products that Panasonic has produced over the past decades. Now, while there's no denying the massive appeal behind the incredible products that make up Sony's portfolio, the engineers and designers over at Matsushita certainly earned their title as one of the top rivals in the pantheon of the Japanese electronics industry. So I've owned a wide range of Panasonic televisions over the years, and they all have been some of my absolute favorite CRTs that have ever been in my collection. The quality has always been superb for me, and of course, the design language of many of these tubes has been absolutely top-notch as well. Anecdotally, I've even personally found that their CRTs in particular seem to be far more reliable for me than some of their competition. I've always seemed to be fine-tuning many of the Sony sets that pass through my hands, but rarely ever do I need to adjust or refurbish anything originating from Matsushita. Of course, all of this isn't intended to dethrone the king, though. There is good reason behind why Sony is the first name everyone thinks of when talking about CRT televisions. But honestly, if Sony's the one at the top of that pedestal of quality, in my personal opinion, Panasonic absolutely has earned that place immediately next to them up there. What I really need to do at some point, though, is conduct a comparison of these two brands with one of the other big names in CRTs, JVC. Surprisingly enough, I've never actually owned a proper JVC television, well, save for the tubes that are inside of my 1702 monitors. But I would absolutely love to get my hands on a nice iArt at some point, or even more so, one of those fantastic D-series sets. I've seen them in person before in the collections of some of my friends, and holy smokes, a big curved tube with component inputs is just really a sight to be seen. Hopefully someday I'll be able to add one of those monsters into the roster and cover it here on my channel. But that about does it for this video. So in conclusion, this Tau here is quite excellent, and I think it makes for a wonderful example of a rather high-end flat-screen tube from the early 2000s. If you come across one of these things in your travels, I absolutely recommend picking it up and enjoying some fantastic CRT goodness for yourself. But as always, I thank you for joining me again here on Steve's Assorted Stuff, and be sure to stick around for some of the other assorted stuff that I have in the pipeline for you in the future. But until we meet again next time, have a nice day, everybody.